Greetings, AP European Scholars, Unit 7 review, beginning with question 1 on page 34 in the Yellow Book. Compare and contrast political liberalism with political conservatism in the first half of the 19th century in Europe. As far as conservatism goes, conservatism was led by Austrian Clemens von Metternich, and the Congress of Vienna was a meeting of the victors over Napoleon. That would be Prussia, Austria, Russia, and Britain. Their goal was, one, legitimacy. For example, in a very far-sighted move, they restored the Bourbon dynasty in the person of Louis XVIII as a means to restore France to conservatism. And two, the goal was a balance of power in Europe. The Concert of Europe is the name of the agreement between conservative rulers to suppress disruptions to peace and the restored control of national elites. Sources of disruption included liberalism, nationalism, and socialism. The revolutions of 1848 in Italy, Austria, and Germany were all eventually suppressed. Austria, in particular, feared social disintegration from its many different ethnic groups. Liberalism is defined as having two characteristics: an increase of individual rights, although some bourgeoisie wanted to share power with the nobility without sharing it with the peasants or the city poor below them, and two, the restriction of power of government. So one, individual rights, two, restricting the power of government. Liberals wanted greater freedom. Their focus was not on stability. That's what the conservatives looked for. Question 2, analyze the shifts in European balance of power in the period 1763 to 1848. This was a question I gave you guys this year. 1763, France loses North America, namely Quebec and Canada, to the British, and Louisiana to Spain. 1783, Britain loses the American Revolutionary War, and the French aided the Americans. A little revenge there. 1789 to 1815 is the beginning of the French Revolution and into the Napoleon era. France eventually went to war with most of Europe, and after Napoleon's rise to power in 1799, France became the dominant continental power, conquering Austria, Italy, the German states, Spain, and temporarily Western Russia. 1815, Napoleon was defeated, and the winners sought a balance of power via the Congress of Vienna and the Concert of Europe. 1848, liberals and nationalists chafing under conservative control rose up in Vienna, Budapest, Berlin, and Paris. Within the year, all were put down by victorious conservative armies, and a balance of power was restored. In 1848, Russia was instrumental in helping hold Austria together. The Tsar's army was nicknamed the Gendarme, French for police, the Gendarme of Europe, and they, the Russians, do help suppress the revolution in Hungary. Question 3, describe and analyze the impact of the rise of Russia on international relations in Europe in the period from 1685 to 1815. Well, 1682 to 1721 is Peter the Great, and he wins that great northern war against Sweden, which gives Peter a window on the west, which is St. Petersburg, a city he builds from scratch. 1762 to 1796 is Catherine the Great, and she will take the Crimea on the Black Sea, and she'll take part of Poland during its partitions in the late 1700s. 1814, it was a Russian army that marched into Paris at the head of an alliance of anti-Napoleon armies that defeats him and ends up sending him to Elba. 1815, Russia was one of the parties to a successful Congress of Vienna that dictated the terms of a post-Napoleon conservative European order. Question 4, analyze the extent to which conservatives in continental Europe were successful in achieving their goals between 1815 and 1851. Draw your examples from at least two states. Let's look at France. 1815, the Congress of Vienna imposes a conservative status quo on Europe, and it restores legitimate monarchs, namely in France, the Bourbon dynasty in the person of Louis XVIII, with a new legislature very strictly limited, only giving power to those who have a certain amount of wealth. In France, Charles X follows the death of Louis XVIII. Charles is a reactionary, which is a super conservative, who issued the July Ordinances, also called the July Decrees, banning liberal protests. He will flee France in the July 1830 revolution and is replaced by another monarchist from the Orleans line, and that is Louis Philippe. And Louis called himself the bourgeois monarch, but the franchise and the power and power remained limited to the wealthy, and labor unions were suppressed. In 1848, Louis Philippe is overthrown in another revolution, and a free election seemed to be a victory of liberalism, electing Napoleon's nephew, Louis Napoleon. But Louis Napoleon does a sort of an auto coup, a coup d'etat on himself, overthrowing his own government, the government of France, and he declares himself to be Emperor Napoleon III, and this is another defeat for liberalism, which, remember, is for greater, not less, self-government. As far as Austria goes, Metternich is the architect of the Congress of Vienna and the Concert of Europe. Metternich supports the Carlsbad decrees, which impose strict censorship on German universities, sources of potential liberal unrest. In 1848, liberal and nationalist uprisings occurred in Vienna and Budapest, in Italy, and in Bohemia, but within a year, these uprisings were defeated by conservative Austrian and Russian armies. Prussia. In 1848, the Frankfurt Parliament offers the Prussian king, Frederick William IV, the crown of united Germany, which he turned down in contempt because it was offered from the gutter, quote unquote. The Prussian government supported suppression of rebellion in Berlin in 1848. And finally, in relatively democratic Great Britain, from 1799 to 1800, you had the Combination Acts, which banned trade unionism, this fear of radicalism in the labor world. In 1819, you have the Peterloo Massacre in Manchester, out of St. Peter's Church, occurs where protesters are demanding greater representation. 1819, the Six Acts banned radical meetings, and in 1838 through 1850, the charter movement had a wide following and demanded political reforms, but it was not immediately successful. Those are the questions for Unit 7. Let's move on into Unit 8, which was focusing on nationalism. In particular, this is the period where Italy and Germany are formed. But let's look at question 1 here. From the period 1861 to 1914, analyze how various Russians perceive the condition of the Russian peasantry and explain how they propose to change that condition. Without looking at documents, you should be able to remember, and this was a DBQ, and I don't give you any of the documents here because this is basically a question that you should be able to do without or without documents. Tsar Alexander II emancipated the serfs in 1861. Alexander III's program of orthodoxy, nationality, and autocracy was a statement of conservatism. Two radical groups, the People's Will and Land and Freedom, were both violently suppressed by the government, sending people to Siberia and hanging these revolutionaries. Sergei Witt's attempts to improve industry and education, tried to buy the autocratic czarist monarchy support for those who wanted progress. Kerensky's provisional government, after the abdication during World War I of Tsar Nicholas II, also was an attempt to bring change. And Lenin's Bolsheviks, 6 months after Kerensky's provisional government, will impose communism. If you remember, communism does promise to be the people's voice, and communism did confiscate private farms and created collective farms worked by all. Questions 2 and 3. Why was there greater political liberalization in Western Europe than in Russia? Well, let's look at Western Europe. Western Europe had an agricultural revolution, which led to an industrial revolution. The power of aristocrats was replaced by capitalists. Trade became less restricted, more laissez-faire. That's economic conditions. Social conditions in Western Europe. Western Europe became capitalist. There was better education, meaning higher literacy. Labor unions became legalized and at least tolerated. Labor parties arose. There's greater social mobility. In England, there are a series of reform bills which increase voter participation. Russia, in contrast, economically, basically lacked industry. And Russia arguably is a feudal country with serfdom lasting all the way till 1861. Socially, there's very little industry. The middle class is of minor significance. There's oppressive serfdom for the masses. The Tsar is an autocratic ruler denying political participation, including individual rights, freedom of religion, social mobility. He practices censorship, and his secret police are everywhere hunting down troublemakers. There were many suppressions of moderate movements towards liberalism, including the Decembrist movement in 1825. Remember, these soldiers, these officers who came back from Western Europe are bringing their French revolutionary ideas, and they are killed. Also, Alexander III and Nicholas II suppressed land and freedom, the people's will, socialist groups. And remember Bloody Sunday, 1905, the Tsar is going to murder, and we don't even know today whether it was just hundreds or whether it was up in the thousand range, but protesters who are asking for reform, who are asking for liberalization. Question 4, describe and analyze the differences in ways in which artists and writers portrayed the individual during the Italian Renaissance and the Romantic era. Well, during the Italian Renaissance, humanists looked to Athens and Rome for artistic ideals about human perfection. Michelangelo's Sistine Chapel and the David showed the beauty of the human form. Erasmus emphasized the capacity of humans to act virtuously through the use of reason in his Praise of Folly, and Thomas More wrote of an ideal utopia based upon reason. The Renaissance looked to the past for examples of human perfection, dignity, and glory. Romanticism, cross out that first sentence in that first blank, doesn't really make any sense as I look at it, but jumping down to they, the Romantics, did not seek to understand the world through reason and logic. In fact, it was Enlightenment reason that produced the horrors of the French Revolution, Napoleon, and the unsettling industrial revolution, and the growing filthy cities. The Romantics reacted against greed, poverty, and the ugliness of these cities. Their focus was not on individuals' capacity for reason, but rather on emotional sensitivity, intuition, and feeling. Romantic artists like Byron and Shelley wrote about feelings. Beethoven's music was full of emotional passion. Frankenstein by Mary Shelley was a criticism of reason and the creation of monsters. And the monsters referring to the modern age, the monstrosities that are being created by this transformation of society. Post-Napoleonic painters criticized the carnage of the French Revolution and Napoleon. So people we've already looked at. Goya's The Sleep of Reason produces monsters in the 3rd of May, 1808, this massacre in a plaza in Spain by French invading soldiers. Theodore Géricault's The Raft of the Medusa, British landscapes by John Constable and Mr. Turner. Question 5, compare and contrast the foreign policies of Metternich and Bismarck. Okay, keep in mind here, one guy's an Austrian, one guy is a German. Metternich opposed liberalism and nationalism. Metternich worked for a balance of power after Napoleon's defeat and was the host of the Congress of Vienna and the architect of the Concert of Europe. Metternich worked to keep Germany divided and weak. Metternich's number one goal was to maintain Habsburg/Austrian control over the multi-ethnic empire of Magyars, which are Hungarians, Slavs, and I've misspelled it here, slaves, but you'll figure that out, it's Slavs, Germans, Serbs, Bosnians, each who wanted self-government, who wanted freedom, who wanted at least autonomy. Many wanted outright independence. Metternich, to promote a balance of power, had the Congress of Vienna put the legitimate Bourbon dynasty back on the French throne in the person of Louis XVIII. The 1848 revolution, which toppled Louis Philippe, who came after Louis XVIII and after Charles X, also toppled Metternich, who had to flee Vienna. But eventually the Austrian and later the Hungarian rebels are suppressed. As far as Otto von Bismarck, things are different here. A country is coming together out of nothing. Bismarck used nationalism to achieve German unification in 1871. He used 3 wars to achieve his aim through blood and iron. First, he goes to war against Denmark over Schleswig-Holstein, which are these provinces of southern Denmark. He goes to war against Austria, puts them in their place in 1866. Then finally, 1870-71, Bismarck goes to war against France after the Ems Dispatch, and this is called the Franco-Prussian War. The Prussian army defeated Napoleon III at the Battle of Sedan and captures him. And Bismarck will orchestrate the southern German states joining the northern German Confederation led by Prussia against France. 6, analyze 3 examples of the relationship between Romanticism and nationalism before 1850. Well, remember, Romanticism emphasized emotion, spirit, passion, beauty over reason. Similarly, with nationalism, which exalted devotion to one's country as primarily being a spiritual reality. So Romanticism, the beauty of your language, of your history, of your stories, of your folklore are being tied with the creation of brand new countries coming out from the control of others, or perhaps just being divided like the Germans. For example, this idea that there's one German VOLK, one German folk, pride in German art and music. For example, Richard Strauss's operas about a Teutonic past. You have Grimm's fairy tales become very popular throughout Germany. Ludwig van Beethoven's music. This all coincides with Bismarck's movement to unite a previously divided German states. In England, the 19th century age of Victoria saw British pride, military and economic power grew, and an increase in democracy. In France, even after the turmoil of the French Revolution and consequent revolts, France prided itself in being the spiritual champion of liberty. And you see this in paintings such as Liberty Leading the People by Eugene Delacroix, in the book Les Miserables by Victor Hugo, which is about a struggle of one man for justice, this heroic individual against a corrupt system. Questions 7 through 8. To what extent did Romanticism challenge Enlightenment views of human beings in the natural world? Well, the emphasis of the Enlightenment is on reason and science, and this contributed and accompanied the Industrial Revolution. The Enlightenment thinkers believed in the perfectibility of man, and the philosophers believed that through social reform, society could be made perfect. The Enlightenment thinkers believed in a world controlled by natural laws, for example, Isaac Newton and René Descartes. There was the belief that science and math were superior to religion. There was the belief in a mechanistic and personal God, deism. Locke taught a social contract based on natural law, based on reason, between a natural law between men. And the French Revolution and the outcome of the Enlightenment, the French Revolution was the outcome of the Enlightenment, which is also called the Age of Reason. And one of the reactions of the Romantics is the French Revolution. It's all very fascinating and interesting to talk about and study, but the bloodshed was in the millions if you go from 1879 all the way through the end of Napoleon. This was a brutal period in European history, and it's being laid at the feet of those who argue that reason will build us and bring us a better world. Romanticism says that emotion is superior to reason. It's partly contributed to nationalism and the revival of religion. Romanticism challenged the rational emphasis of the Enlightenment philosophers. There was a distrust of modern industry, of cities, of progress, of reason. The emphasis is not on the mechanics of nature, but on nature itself, its beauty. Thus the art of waterfalls and mountains and clouds and oceans and things like that. The emphasis is not on society, but on the heroic individual. Compare and contrast Enlightenment and Romantic views of the relationship between God and the individual. While the Enlightenment championed the primacy of reason, God is impersonal, and the idea of deism, Locke posited a tabula rasa, that we're born a blank slate, and the idea here is that man is perfectible with a better environment. And Locke is denying the Christian idea of original sin. Man comes out of the womb a blank slate. Good government, good training, good education can make a good person, a good society. Definitely trust and reason here. Voltaire's crushed the infamous thing. Jean-Jacques Rousseau's man is born free, but everywhere is in chains. This call for a more, scratch that thought, for the French Revolution's brutal treatment of religion. Romanticism, you have a reaction against the Enlightenment emphasis on reason, the idea that nature reveals the glory of God and can be seen in the Romantics' fascination with nature and art showing nature scenes. 18th century Great Awakening in Europe saw German pietism. This is sort of like an awakening of religious revival within the Lutheran Church and the founding of the Moravian Brethren. You have John and Charles Wesley in Great Britain beginning what's called the Methodist Church, which is a revival movement against Anglicanism. And in the Catholic Church, there's a religious revival in the Catholic Church, and Sacré-Cœur, this beautiful cathedral in Paris, is built as expiation for the national guilt of the French revolutionaries. Question 10. Analyze the differences between the political ideals expressed in the visual arts of the Renaissance and the political ideals expressed in the visual arts of the neoclassical Romantic period. Well, the Renaissance, as far as state and political power, Brunelleschi's dome shows sort of the glory of Florence as a polis. The Medicis in Florence aimed to have Florence, a city sort of renowned for its art. Point 2. The art of the Renaissance reflected the status of wealthy noblemen, portraitures such as Hans Holbein's paintings, and many of the Italian artists are doing portraitures. Celebration of the church and the papacy. The Sistine Chapel ceiling in Rome would be an example. St. Peter's Cathedral, this huge, biggest church in Christendom. Neoclassical art refers to that art that celebrates free people. And you see some of this in Jacques-Louis David's art, and he's famous for the Oath of Horatii, the lictors bringing Brutus the bodies of his sons, and the tennis court oath, and the death of Marat. And Marat is kind of a modern-day martyr killed by Charlotte Corday. He's a man who's sort of the voice of the revolution. As far as Romantic art, for nationalism, you could point to Delacroix's Liberty Leading the People. Remember that sort of Statue of Liberty-looking French woman who's leading a tricolor flag over a barricade against, in a battle scene. The 3rd of May by Francisco Goya. Criticism of royalty and authority. You can see this in the raft of the Medusa. Analyze artistic and literary responses to industrialization over the course of the 19th century. As far as Romanticism, landscapes of nature and rural life are prominent in Romantic art. Again, Turner and Constable are two very famous British landscape artists. As far as realism, you've got The Gleaners by Millais. You have Zola's Germinal, a book about exploited coal miners. You have Flaubert's Madame Bovary. And you have Charles Dickens' books are about themes of crime and poverty and suffering in the urban city. You'll notice here there's been a lot of questions asking you something about Romanticism. So have something to say about Romanticism, whether they're asking you to compare it with something or the importance of how it's being tied with nationalism. Question 12. Referring to specific individuals or works, discuss ways in which two of the following express the concept of nationalism in the 19th century. Composer, Richard Strauss's Ring Cycle of 4 German operas with Norse gods, Rhine maidens, glorifying the myth of the Teutonic Nordic past. Tchaikovsky's 1812 Overture, celebrating the destruction of Napoleon's invading army. As far as artists, again, the 5th of May, 1808 by Goya, with his French firing squad killing a Spanish patriot. And Liberty Leading the People by Theodore Géricault. Question 13, the second half of the 19th century, most European governments were conservative. To what extent is this quotation accurate? Well, in Great Britain, a big exception here, at the end of the century, Disraeli's conservatives and Gladstone's liberals are pushing liberal reforms. They're pushing for public education, for civil service reform based upon merit, not patronage. They're pro-union. They're expanding the franchise, the right to vote. They're pushing for public health and public housing laws and permission, to strike. So Britain is a great exception. And for France, Napoleon III takes over the country, declares himself an emperor, and provokes a war with Prussia, which France loses. In Prussia, a constitutional monarchy under Wilhelm I and then son Wilhelm II are running the country. Chancellor Otto von Bismarck is a very pro-nationalist, anti-liberal reactionary who is, creating a Germany by blood and iron. No more of this 1848 offering the crown from a gutter to a Prussian king who is not going to take it. Germany will be created to a certain extent here by force. Of course, everybody's on the bandwagon as they're going around beating up on Danes and Austrians and the hated French. Russia, under autocratic czars, Alexander II frees the serfs. Alexander III and his autocracy, orthodoxy, and nationalism are stating that this will be what all Russian subjects will be either orthodox or will be studying, and public discourse will be in Russian and Polish and Lithuanian and Estonian and all these other language groups, their art, their culture, their education is going to be suppressed. The Tsar has secret police, and there is no representation. Austria-Hungary is under a Habsburg emperor. Metternich, an arch-conservative, organizes a conservative post-Napoleonic European order, which successfully survived the revolution of 1848. Austria also suppressed Louis Kossuth in his Magyar uprising, or his Hungarian uprising of 1848, but in 1867 made Austria the Austro- or Austria-Hungarian Empire in a bid to placate the Hungarians, who are a very large minority within the empire. So there is this kind of a co-regency where the power is still unified in the Habsburg crown. One last question for Unit 8, and that's comparing Cavour and Bismarck and looking at differences and similarities in the methods in making Italy and making Germany. So let's look at the Italians here. Camillo Cavour supported industry and built up the army. Otto von Bismarck built up industry and built up the army, and he is going to precede the political unification of Germany by pushing for what's called the Zollverein, which is the breaking down of trade barriers and internal tariffs between the German states. So economic liberalization is going to precede political unity. But very similar here. Both guys are pushing for industrialization and building up an army. The Italian unification effort is led by Piedmont in the north, and the German unification effort is led by Prussia. Italy is allied with France to drive Austria out of Lombardy by war, and the Germans are going to war against Denmark over Schleswig-Holstein, and they're going to go to war against Austria, and then they're going to go to war against France. So there's a difference here. The Italians are allying with France, and the Germans are fighting the French over the Ems Dispatch in the Franco-Prussian War. And Prussia will take Alsace-Lorraine from France, and this becomes a huge grievance in France leading up to World War I. Similarities: King Victor Emmanuel is the king of Piedmont, and King Wilhelm I is the king and later the Kaiser, the emperor of Germany, of Prussia, and then the created state of Germany. And he's going to be crowned in the Hall of Mirrors after the humiliating defeat of France in the Franco-Prussian War. Revolutionaries take Rome in 1870 as part of the putting together of modern-day Italy, angering the Pope. And Bismarck is going to move against the Catholic Church. He's going to take over the schools, especially in southern Germany, which is mostly Catholic. This is called the Kulturkampf. Other things, doing what has to be done, that's referred to as Realpolitik. Blood and iron is the description of the use of force in creating modern-day Germany. Bismarck will co-opt the Social Democrats, and he is going to pass some laws which are being pushed by German socialists, and this is going to rob some of the support from the Social Democrats who are on the outs, who aren't able to do anything. In Germany, we'll see the first old age pensions, the first health care, and the first unemployment and disability pay. And keep in mind here, we're talking about sort of a proto system of social welfare. This is not the full-blown social welfare you get 100 years later in Europe. Some key differences here. Italy had two strong unification movements. Garibaldi, who is a Republican who wants no king, will submit his army to Cavour, even though Garibaldi was a Republican and not a monarchist. On the other side here, Prussia attacks France, while Piedmont allied with France. So those are some similarities and differences, but you should definitely know these are two countries which for centuries had been divided are now coming together. So carry on with the studying.